it's my great pleasure to introduce David Adler, who was a student of mine in Mainz many years ago. And he recently finished his thesis, which is an absolutely impressive piece of work on so many levels. I'm sure that you can touch only on a few things. I hope that as many of you as possible can read it at some point. David works on office architecture, which at the time I thought was, what a strange what a strange topic, and I was totally impressed by it. So I can only say that David has been working in Bochum in research management for the last few years, and I'll give you the floor now.
Yeah, thank you very much. You should see the slides now, right?
Yeah,
Great.
I can see them.
So thanks for inviting me. I'm happy to be able to present some minor aspects of my PhD research on office architecture. And today I gave it the focus really on office architecture as a discourse machine between communicative promise and problem. And as Johannes already hinted, this is based on my PhD research and on contemporary office architecture. And my main argument is basically that office architecture is only effective by constantly failing to fulfill its technological promise. And I want to get away from this a rather positivistic or business-oriented idea of office architecture as a neutral tool. My methods that I used in my research are discourse analysis on the one hand and ethnography on the other. And in discourse analysis, I try to develop kind of a more bottom-up approach to concepts from hegemony analysis for analyzing the structure of the discourse. And I also used polyphony analysis to analyze how different voices come together and how an internal heterogeneity of the discourse is negotiated. And for the ethnography, I drew on coding from grounded theory, but also modified it in a specific way for my research. And the data I analyzed and on which I will also draw today are, on the one hand, textbooks on office architecture, scientific publications, speeches, but also magazines, business magazines in part on office architecture. And on the other hand, field notes are basically from a 3-month fields trip in an PR agency where I worked on a daily basis, and then adding to that also interviews with architects, but also further employees. And I several times later went back to the agency I worked in to see how the things I had observed have developed further in time. So today, really, I try to focus on the question of how is contemporary office architecture constructed as a communicative technology, and how does this translate into work practices or not? And this or not is quite relevant to me because one of my main goals is a bit to oppose an idea of office architecture as kind of the almighty tool, as architecture responding kind of to an economic context and then providing exactly the spaces that are needed to produce new forms of labor that then feed back into post-Fordist knowledge society and so on. So I try to oppose such a more technological view and give it a more empirical perspective in a certain way, in asking, like, how really are architecture and economic contexts linked? How is architecture related to work practices in the everyday life of organizations? And always with the vision also like what ruptures are in there, what inconsistencies are also in these relationships. And basically in the two question marks you can find here, there's one focusing more on the discourse to the left, and the other focusing more on the ethnographical research to the right. So to give you a bit an idea of what I try to do with what I said, my more bottom-up approach to the overall structure of the discourse is I try to approach it more with a cartography. I started with drawing maps of the key concepts of specific texts, always kind of with the relations between the concepts. And then over the time, I added it up to kind of complex net of relations of the key concepts that I found in the discourse. And so in a way, with this red and green, you see that there is kind of an antagonistic divide in the discourse that I could observe, which kind of emerged from the analysis I did. So on the one hand, you have everything which is associated with the old office. You have office cells, you have hierarchy and all that, which is seen kind of as standing in the way of what's called also the office of the future in the discourse, and which is kind of hindering the development of a greater efficiency and productivity. So the discourse that emerges is generally one where there's an opposite side which has to be overcome. And in a way, communication plays a central role in this structure. Communication, for instance, is directly linked with something like flexibility. It is linked with creativity, but also with office landscapes. And it is opposed to the office cell, which is kind of rather the closed space where direct communication is not possible, but also opposed to bureaucracy, for instance. Now, there are two aspects to it for me. On the one hand, kind of in having all these equivalences with major concepts of the contemporary office discourse, communication is one of the concepts that allows to kind of take a shortcut into the discourse. So if you say communication in your text about office architecture, you don't have to say a lot other things because it's already associated with all the relevant concepts. And it is clear where you stand if we say, like, we need more informal communication. On the other hand, like one thing that is important for me in this, as I said, bottom-up approach is that in the end, this doesn't lead into a total kind of fixed and clear structure where every concept is clearly just on one side. And here we can see this with communication being positively linked with the open space, open plan offices. And when I started, my idea was the contemporary discourse on office architecture, that's kind of all open space and everything has to be super transparent and so on. And there are true aspects to that. But in generally, like the classical open space office is rejected in the discourse because it's not seen as a place for creativity, but rather as a uniform and non-inspiring large office, let's say from the 1980s. So it's rather associated with this time and newer concepts like business clubs or office spaces like combi office are rather something which is discussed then in my discourse, and I will give you an example of this also later. So in a more kind of historical perspective, which I didn't analyze in detail in my discourse, but which can give some orientation for what we will be discussing, I think we could differentiate kind of three phases of how communication is conceived of in the context of office spaces. The first bureaucratic concept of the office is rather trying to restrict communication. Here it's really kind of the order from above, which is legitimate communication, and the report from below, which is legitimate communication. But as communication is structured along hierarchy, you wouldn't expect kind of so much communication between the employees in the organization. That changes a bit with what I would call rather a cybernetic concept of communication in the context of the office. And here it's more about steering communication and not so much restricting communication. Still, the focus here is rather the cognitive and formal information. And the idea is to structure office spaces in a way that they are in accordance with kind of the established processes of working on information. And now the third phase, which is what I will also take up and showing you some quotes in a second, is one where now it's not just about accepting and steering communication, but it's about fostering communication. It's about producing communication in order to create more not just efficiency in the office, but overall productivity by strengthening creativity and innovation. And in this context, it's informal communication, which becomes increasingly relevant. To give you an idea of like how this is taken up in the discourse, here a quote. Most of my quotes, my corpus is in German. This is a text where it's also in English, but when I have translated it, I've added kind of a little T to the reference, so you know that it's a translation that I did. So here it's written: the finding that casual meetings in informal zones, unplanned conversations through the work process during errand running, and spontaneous knowledge exchange all have a cost-saving effect, loosens and relaxes the workspace territory. Access spaces turn from a cost unit to valuable social hubs whose use is encouraged by walkways and bridges winding through the building. And so there are really two dimensions which are bound together in quotes like this. On the one hand, it's communication makes the office more productive. So the spaces where communication happen, they are now valuable social hubs. And on the other hand, there are spaces that produce this communication. So you have the productivity of communication and the production of communication. And just to give you a short visual idea, kind of when there was talk about the bridges and so on, this is an example of an office from Hamburg, where inside of the office building, there's kind of this pseudo-public space where you can gather, and you will walk about bridges, and you have different levels that are kind of intertwined. And so this is taking up these ideas. To give another quote in a similar direction, particularly important are situations that encourage informal communication, including across teams open plan kitchen areas, print points, and furniture systems that allow people to sit or stand together spontaneously all help to foster interdisciplinary exchange. This can help to shorten the time taken to plan and hold meetings and encourage the emergence of innovation. So here again, we have these both aspects. You have spatial aspects that produce communication. You have communication that then makes things more efficient and also more productive in creating innovations. And kind of here with the open plan kitchen areas and so on, you already have kind of something hinting to the fact that now the office is not in a homogeneous space where you only have one type of space, but you have different zones that are intended to fill specific purposes in this context. And here, for instance, you have spaces that are more like classical open plan spaces. You have little rooms for individual work or rooms for little meetings, but also kind of interactive spaces which are in there. So it's not so much here the question of an unmarked space of communication, but rather an heterogeneous arrangement of communication, different communication opportunities. And with all this kind of communication is used in a very general way. In kind of in discourse theory, you could talk about the empty signifier, and to a certain degree, communication is taking up such properties. So because it relates to all these different contexts, it loses its specific signification in a certain way. And what I kind of saw in the discourse is that there are, in a certain way, different types of communication that is talked about in different contexts, but then they are also brought together again, and it's glossed over the difference. For instance, there's kind of the idea communication is making the organization successful. And then in mind, you have specific forms of exchanging information, of increasing perhaps also the community feeling in the organization, which then makes it easier to work together and so on. But it's not all communication that necessarily makes the organization successful. If you think that, of course, you can also communicate to sabotage the organization, can communicate to go into strike, and so on. The other aspect is that specific spaces are producing communication. And here, often, it's kind of a more general idea that if people talk to each other, no matter what the content is, then this is seen as a proof that the spaces are producing communication. But this, again, then is bound together in something which I call kind of a typical syllogism of communication and the discourse, where now you take it that specific spaces are making the organization successful. So kind of you take out this binding idea of specific types of communication that become relevant. But all of this is not staying just on the discursive level in the sense of how communication is represented in the discourse. But in the following quote, you already see that there's also another dimension to it. These distinct zones for thinking and communication, defined by their shape and color, will be deliberately entered and exited. They are designed and defined to varying degrees. These areas will become the breeding grounds for creative ideas and constructive discussions. Feeling comfortable and at ease fosters trust and thus encourages communication. And so what I want to point to here other than the things that we already saw, is that here's the focus on the deliberate decision to use a specific space, to enter it and to exit it. So it's not so much that the office space is just being the frame where everyone is in. It's not so much that people are just working in office spaces, but they're also working with office spaces, in this idea at least. So there is kind of an active intermediary of how the employees deal with the office spaces. And that kind of already leads over to my second bigger aspect, the ethnographical aspect, so to say. And it's the doing communication and doing spaces that are made for communication in a certain way. And here I have two major questions that I want to talk about in the remaining time. Is, on the one hand, how is communication practically accomplished in spaces that are designed to facilitate, foster, and frame communication? And on the other hand, how do employees work on those spaces and changing and adapting them to fulfill their technological promise to really make it happen, that they make you more productive and that they are really producing communication in a certain way? And I would say that one thing I really saw is that there are kind of paradoxical effects of these communication zones. To give you an example from my ethnography, here, this is kind of a group office in which I also sat on a regular basis at the desk C, if you want to know it exactly. And I just want to show you a little situation which I noted down in this context. So one of the employees, Toby, addressed another which was sitting basically just right next to him. Monica, how far are you with the press release? And no response. So I and another colleague, we heard this question and we heard no response. And so we turned around and saw that the colleague had headphones on. So she was in the open communicative group office, but she put something on to be kind of differentiated, distanced from this open space. A little time later, however, she still answered, Toby, I talked to Judith and she wants to have another look at it. And then there's kind of a short interaction. So it's mostly done, right? Yes. And then there's just a little pause of a few seconds. And Toby asked, so I could already have a look at it too. And no response again. So she had the headphones on again. And of course, this is kind of may seem a rather random situation from the office, but it shows a bit that kind of this idea that an open space and proximity, which kind of are the main ideas for communication in office discourses, they don't automatically translate into functioning communication, but we have to consider that they rather produce the need to really manage communication in these spaces. And part of this is that you take yourself out of the communication. And there are two different further aspects that I want to take up in this, is that kind of there's also a burden of this presence of others, this kind of possibility to communicate all the time, which makes also that you communicate perhaps in ways that you don't want to. And here's a quote from an interview I did with one of the employees, who talks about how he himself came into the office first and how he felt. At first, I found it really hard to get into it and express myself freely. I really realized that with every word you choose in a conversation like that, you're not just trying to take into account the one person on the line, but that at the same time, you've got these 7 or other people in the room in mind who are listening to, and that you're still trying to adjust your tone to suit them as well, so that it is okay somehow. Hopefully it will be okay, won't it? And I find that really, it's actually quite stressful. And more than that, he describes how another colleague had the task to do a lot of phone calls in this office space, and she was kind of rather shy. And he describes it as, and that I think was torture. I mean, it was awful. So there's really a strong, emotional aspect to this being exposed in this communicative space, which can be a burden on communication at times. And kind of the other burden that I see there is the expressions giving off. So what would happen more often than not is that there is a phone call with a customer, and at the same time there are discussions in the room, and the discussions they develop, and there's laughter and so on. And then the person on the phone is trying to communicate to the room that they should basically shut up, because it's interfering with the representation of the organization towards the customer. And here, so there's also the managing of space, which becomes important. And another aspect, of course, could be if you talk to another person in the office space, it could bother others also by creating noise and so on. So even if you have these open spaces, if you have proximity and so on, given that you can't communicate with everyone all of the time, just as you cannot not communicate in a certain way, there are always kind of efforts to manage it, and they have paradoxical consequences in the spaces, which make it impossible to just translate specific spaces into communication, which is then efficient for the organization. So rather than producing communication, I would say office spaces are creating the need for an ongoing active and cooperative management of communication within them. And this comes kind of to the last point, the doing space, really. So I see 2 major aspects to that. One I already mentioned a bit. It's choosing the right place. So it's not that the office automatically delivers you what you need for efficient work or something, but it's your responsibility of an employee to always look out for the right place of your task. And that is kind of a question that I would regularly hear in the ethnography. Where should we do this? Like, which is the right place for this task? For instance, do we just have a short chat at your stations where everyone is present too? Do we go to a more informal kitchen for a brainstorming? Do we go to a more formal meeting room for talking to customers, for instance, and so on? So the employees always have to reflect on what effects are the spaces purportedly having on me, and how do I navigate the best in these spaces. So basically I just wanted to relate this back, because here you have this concept of really different office typologies in one office, and then it's a responsibility a bit of the employees to choose the right one, which is a bit a countercurrent to the promise in the discourse that the spaces will make you more productive. Now kind of you're responsible on your own to then make it really happen, that you are more productive in a certain way. And so the last aspect to it is kind of making space right. So all those office spaces are designed with communication and creativity in mind on a day-to-day basis. It's not that they automatically produce the good communication in a certain way, the creative practices that you expect. So the employees in the organization or the different levels of the organization start to adapt the spaces to make them more like the promise they gave. And I could observe kind of a bigger process of really changing the space. There was a group that introduced a new lounge in the office space where I did my participatory observation. And I could kind of follow them through this process. And just to give you an example of one meeting where they kind of described the current state of the office from their perspective. And this was an office which already was planned with these concepts in mind. And here, one of them please says, that was the first thing that I saw here when I walked into the kitchen as a space for informal meetings. I thought I was going mad. I've never seen anything like it, not even in the ugliest doctor's office, such hideous city pictures. There's pictures on the wall. And another one said, you know, we want to be a bit more creative, or I mean, we are a creative agency, so that needs to come across, but still somehow professional and clean and so on. So you see these spaces which are already developed as spaces for fostering communication, creativity, and so on, but then kind of they don't necessarily deliver, and the employees look for the bad things in the spaces, which can be changed to realize that which has been promised. So office architecture, to sum this up for me, is not just a mere technology, but it's often more something like a materialized imaginary. So the imaginary as the promise to create productive labor by fostering communication and creativity. And I just want to give you kind of one last quote to show that kind of the things that I observed in the discourse, these ideas of how spaces really produce communication, creativity, and so on, are not just kind of technical expert knowledge that then is translated into material artifacts that then blindly does what it's intended to do with the employees, but rather these ideas are also circulating in the organizations themselves, and these ideas and imaginaries that are circulating are binding office architecture as materiality and as kind of this which is it intended for together in a certain way. And here we have an extract from an interview on this process of changing the office space by adding a lounge for informal meetings. Yes, well, that's actually the main and the intention behind it all, that people really enjoy coming here, that they're happy to get up in the morning and come here because they feel at home here. And the surroundings, along with the interior design, certainly play their part in that. And then you actually are more productive, and then you feel at home, you can get more done. That's a fact without a doubt. So here kind of she states this fact that the spaces have the according effects. And kind of to really come towards the end, I would say what in the ethnographic part is really can be seen is that employees work in, but they also work with and on spaces. and they try to make the space work. They try to realize all these concepts of what spaces are expected to deliver within the organization. And this can be by installing kind of a new lounge and by reducing the visibility by adding plants, but it can also be by really adding a new wall. And this all can then again have paradoxical results, as in one case where there was kind of an element for separating the space installed because there was too much chatter in kind of a bigger group office. And then people started to call themselves, and you could hear like both parts in one room. And again, it kind of posed a problem for the organization. So to come a bit back to my beginning, I try to give you some hints like on how I analyzed this interplay, with the first question mark more being a focus on discourses, the second question mark more being a focus on the ethnography without really being able to separate it all together. And my question really was how these aspects are linked, but also what ruptures you can see in there. And in the end, kind of, it's not so much a stable fit between the different domains, between economy, architecture, and work practices, but it's rather the ongoing articulation and accomplishment that only creates kind of temporary stability for the social reality of architecture. And this is really for me where the concept of performativity in my work comes in, where it's an ongoing discursive and practical articulation and accomplishment, which is at play. And so my plaidoyer in this context of work, at least, is not just to do a discourse analysis focusing on the textual analysis of expert discourses, but also not just to do an ethnography that looks at a local community and how they deal with pre-existing spaces, but really look at the interplay of different dimensions and different aspects. And so in my research, I try to give it kind of the framework of a performativity analysis by looking at how knowledge, materiality, practices, and imaginaries really come together to create kind of this always just temporary and unstable kind of social reality of office spaces. And with this, I say thanks a lot, and I'm looking forward to your questions.